And I hate this stupid debate that's going on right now about the 4 best teams versus the 4 teams that deserve to be there. That's why my call right now to the future College Football Playoff Committee is to set the expectations for the 12-team playoff right now. You've got the opportunity. The ball is in your court. And here's what I foresee happening. I foresee rules that have kind of been established a couple years ago and years past being played out next year in an entirely different college football landscape than the rules were created in, being played out in. For example, why are we going to have the top 5 conference champion winners as automatic bids? Last time I checked, the Pac's down to 2 teams. So why don't we just make it 4? Why don't we have rules of like, this is how you qualify to get into the playoff? This is how many conference champions make it. This is how many at-large bids make it. And here's what's going to qualify for an at-large bid. You heard me earlier talk with Grant Koppel. You could set a couple common sense rules that would just make the playoff a lot more enjoyable and would ensure that we don't see any rematches in the first round or a game happen for the 3rd time until the national championship game. So here's my proposal, okay? Couple rules. Number 1, if you have played any team at all, whether it's a conference opponent or a non-conference opponent, you will not be able to rematch them in the first round, okay? And so, for example, let's say Ohio State and Michigan play each other in the regular season, but they don't play each other in the conference championship game. They still cannot play each other in the first round of the playoff. Let's assume that Michigan beat Ohio State and went on to win the conference and received an automatic bid for being a Big Ten conference champion winner. Okay, this also makes it simple. If there's 4 major conferences and there's 4 teams with a first round bye, the 4 conference winners will get first round bye. Let's make it easier, not harder. Why would we have 5 automatic bids, but only 4 of them are going to get a bye? Again, let's make this easier rather than harder. Let's make it less about debate and more about actually knowing who's going to go there. Okay? Nobody asks questions about, well, who does the NFL committee think's going to get in? And could you imagine when we get to the end of the year? Well, I don't think the Vikings should be in because they don't have Kirk Cousins. Give me a break. A team earns it by wins and losses on the field. But it doesn't just have to be wins and losses versus a different tier of opponents. I've mentioned it before earlier this season, and you should go back and listen for yourself to the episode where I lay out how to make sure that the college football schedules are balanced across all Power 5 teams. You could set up something like an ACC Big Ten Challenge like college basketball does and like they're doing right now as we record this podcast. There are plenty of options that they could do to set up schedules that would be balanced, but also maintain the integrity of college football while allowing teams to have 2 open schedules where they can play a non-Power 5 team to help support them and also have somewhat of a kind of lead up into the year if they want to schedule those early or schedule them late before rivalry weekend. Whatever they want to do, they can have those 2 games still to help other teams that need the help, and I'm all for that. But we can set up a balanced regular season schedule that makes it fair, and we can also set up rules that have we slot it out. There's no teams that are going to be up for debate. We just slot it out. Hey, if you have 3 or more losses or 4 or more losses, you're out. What are we going to do about Notre Dame? They don't have a conference championship. If Notre Dame has 2 or 3 losses every year, is it just going to be up for debate of, well, should they get in, should they not get in? I mean, I've got questions, and I think that the committee should do a good job right now of answering those questions, getting out ahead of it, so that next year we're not looking at debates. Because right now, if you look at the 12-team playoff and the current setup that they have, you would have Tulane in, assuming that they win their conference championship, which Liberty is right behind Tulane, as well as this non-Power 5 team that would get the automatic bid. So that would be one of those slots as well. But then you have several 2-loss teams that are just kind of stacked up, okay? For example, we've got Louisville, who's going to play against FSU for the conference championship. But we also have Ole Miss, Oklahoma, and Penn State just kind of sitting there without a conference championship game to play, but all are 2-loss teams. Now is where it gets really gray as well. The committee's going to have to think, do we now hurt teams for getting to play in the conference championship game, but losing? For example, in Iowa, they go into this Big Ten conference championship game as a 2-loss team. But then we all believe, and we'll see what happens, they got to play the game. That's why they play the game. But we assume that they lose to Michigan. Now Iowa's a 3-loss team, but Penn State, Oklahoma, and Ole Miss, they didn't have the opportunity to play in a conference championship game. Do we now say, well, Iowa had their shot, so they're out, and we just randomly select another one of those teams that we think has the best resume as a 2-loss team? I mean, give me a break. The debates are going to be endless. Now, I love what Grant Koppel said in today's episode. He said, well, at least, and my beautiful wife, Haley, I give her a shout out as well, has also said this to me as well. Well, at least then, this year, all 8 of these teams that we think should have a fair shot to be in the playoff would be in a 12-team playoff format. And that is the moral of the story. These top 8 teams that are undoubtedly better than the rest of the country, in my opinion, would all be in a 12-team format. And assuming that there wouldn't be drastic amounts of crazy upsets. Because if it is the conference winner, then Oklahoma State, if they beat Texas, they're in. Iowa, if they beat Michigan, they're in. Louisville, if they beat Florida State, they're in. Right? So you see my point, how there's a lot of chaos. And I just think that the committee would do a great job of getting out ahead of that and slotting out exactly how each team would be able to make it into the playoff. I know that it's kind of fun and the media thrives off of all this debate, and there should still be debate throughout the year. But I would love it if we had a formula for each team to make the playoff, instead of every year giving the benefit of the doubt, and I say this as an Alabama fan, instead of every year giving the benefit of the doubt to these powers at large. I mean, could you imagine if Clemson was a 2 or 3 loss team right now? Could you imagine if Ohio State or Alabama or whatnot was a 2 or 3 loss team, kind of on the bubble, looking right on the bubble of that 12 seed? I mean, would we just give it to them because they're a team that's been in the playoff in years past? We have to consider all of these things. We have to consider schedules. And one of the things that I mentioned with Grant on this episode that I just really hope you enjoyed, and I think is a good point, is that we're going to see less undefeated teams, I believe. We're going to see less one-loss teams, I believe. There's going to be a lot more competition within conferences, and I think teams will naturally beat each other up. So I do have a problem with assuming that Alabama and Georgia are going to play each other every year in the SEC championship. I do have a problem with assuming that Ohio State and Michigan are going to play each other every year in the Big Ten championship game. I have a problem with that because there are going to be tougher schedules, and it's not a guarantee that we will see those powerhouses matching up with each other every single year in those conference championship games. But if you do think that, and if you do think that these teams are a major step ahead of the rest of the field, then I've got questions. And I've got questions regardless. Why in the world do we still have Oregon as the 5th ranked team in the country? And why in the world are Kirk Herbstreit and Greg McElroy and all of these guys, I'm not trying to be a hater, I'm not trying to be a negative Nancy, but I mean, we've got to be better. First of all, the committee has got to be better. That's it. I have been saying it for weeks. You've had the opportunity to get it right. You still kept Oregon at that number 5 slot, while teams behind them have better resumes, have better wins, have had tougher roads. Oregon just got their first top 25 win this past weekend. And we've kept them at 5 this whole time. I have a problem with that. I have a real problem with that. Not to mention a team like Ohio State that just had their first loss later in the year. They're a good football team. I think everyone knows that Michigan is the better team. They won the game. They earned it. There's no excuses this year. They didn't even have Coach Harbaugh on the sidelines. I think we would all agree, like I said earlier, McCord isn't as talented at the quarterback position. He's got arguably one of the best players in college football at his disposal at wide receiver and one of the best running backs in the country. And he turned the ball over twice. And that's what cost them. And when you play a team like Michigan that has a good defense, that runs the clock down on offense, that runs the ball well, and that controls the clock, you cannot afford to have 2 turnovers. And like Johnny and I said last week, that was the recipe for Michigan to win. Get a lead early, maintain control of the football, and cause turnovers. It's going to be hard to play Michigan from behind. But Ohio State has supposedly should have all the tools and the weapons at their disposal to do so. They just don't have a talented enough quarterback, it seems, this year. But at the end of the day, if you really think that Georgia, Alabama, Michigan, and Ohio State are the 4 best teams in the country, let's create a path for them to do so without a debate. And maybe 4 teams just isn't quite enough to have in there. So the 12-team playoff should be a blast, and it should allow for all 4 of those teams to be in the playoff. But again, let's go back to those couple ground rules. Number 1, no first-round rematches. And number 2, no potential rematches for a third time before the national championship game. So if Georgia and Alabama were to play each other in the regular season, were to play each other in the SEC championship game, we ensure that they are on opposite sides of the bracket to where they cannot meet again for a third time unless it is the national championship game. Everybody wants to see these matchups. I, for one, would love to see an 8-team playoff this year. There are several teams that I just don't know. We can speculate, we can argue, we can say things off of years past. I have my thoughts and opinions and feelings. Grant has his. You watching, you have yours. But we just don't know. And that's why we play the game. And that's why it'd be more fun if all of these teams had an opportunity. If Texas wins their conference championship game. If Oregon beats Washington, how do you put Oregon in over Washington? How do you put Oregon in over Texas? How do you put Oregon in over an Ohio State team that didn't get to play in a conference championship? These are the questions that we'll ask, and we just don't know. Of course, it'll be fun, and it'll be chaos, because college football is one of the greatest sports in all of the world. In my opinion, it's my favorite thing to watch. There's chaos, there's opportunities every single week, and rivalry week showed us just how insane it was.